Welcome to the public meeting for the Audit Committee, May 3rd, 2022. I'd like to call this meeting to order, and our first order of business is the acknowledgement of traditional lands. Dan Mackerel, our external member, will be honoring the lands today.
Thank you. Halton, as we know it today, is rich in history and modern traditions of many First Nations in the Métis. From the Anishinaabe to the Attawandaron, the Haudenosaunee, and the Métis, these lands surrounding the Great Lakes are steeped in Indigenous history. As we gather today on these treaty lands, we have the responsibility to honor and respect the four directions: land, waters, plants, animals, ancestors that walked before us, and all the wonderful elements of creation that exist. We would like to acknowledge and thank the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation for sharing their traditional territory with us.
Thank you very much for that, Dan. Our next item is declarations of possible conflict of interest. Does anyone have a declaration for public session? Seeing none, the next item is approval of the agenda, and I'm looking for a mover and a seconder. Jean and Dan, are there any comments or questions about the agenda? Thank you. All those in favor? And I don't see Sana has arrived yet, so could we please note that Sana is not here at this point? Thank you. That motion carries. The next item of business is to approve the minutes of our meeting from February 22nd, 2022. Could I please have a mover? Dan, seconded by Leah. Thank you. Are there any comments or questions regarding the minutes? Seeing none, all those in favor? Thank you very much. That passes unanimously. Now moving on to our approval of business transacted in private session. Oh dear, now I have to find that one. I should not have closed it. Just give me a second. I knew there was a reason why I had left it open. Here we go. And the motion is, be it resolved that the Audit Committee select option 1 as the process for tendering external audit services, with services beginning in the 2022-2023 fiscal year, and I so move. Looking for a seconder. Thank you, Dan. Are there any comments or questions about this item? Seeing none, all those in favor? Thank you. That motion carries. The next item is our action items for today for public session: external audit plan for 2021-2022, financial statement, and I would ask Superintendent Nagoy to speak to this.
Thank you, and perhaps I will start and pass it on to our external audit partner for a bit of a discussion on the document that is attached. As it is with every year, the Audit Committee's mandate is to approve and recommend to the Board of Trustees the external audit plan and the fees. The fees for this year's audit are $78,960, and they do include the 7-month report. And in accordance with the regulation, the audit will take place within the expected timeframe and cover the expected areas within our financial statements, both in terms of presentation and disclosure, as well as review of the material transactions. And with that, I would like to pass it on to Lillian Cheng, our audit manager.
Thank you, Superintendent Ngoy, and thank you to the Audit Committee for having us here today. My name is Lillian Chung. I know you know me. I'm the audit partner on the audit of Halton District School Board representing Deloitte. I'm here today with Francesca Liberatore, who is my audit manager, and together we intend to walk through some of the key highlights within our 2022 audit service plan. At a high level, our audit service plan is fairly consistent with the prior year. On an annual basis, we do, as part of our planning exercise, which commences around this time of the year, assess the audit risks for the year. The audit risks for the year will drive the extent of our focus, as well as in the fall of every year. We did outline with part of our audit plan this year some of the key areas of audit risks that we identify for this year in particular. And if Carrie, if you don't mind moving on to the next page, I do want to highlight for the committee's information that as part of our overall audit risk assessment in the current year, we did identify 6 areas of audit risks. These are fairly consistent with the prior year, with the exception of one additional item that I'll be asking my colleague Francesca to speak to a little bit later on when we move through the audit risks. And that relates to the introduction and preparation for the new public sector accounting standards that are coming into place in the current year. That is a change. And these standards are not coming into effect for the fiscal 22 year end, but they're coming into effect for fiscal 2023. So as part of our audit exercise this year, we do want to have and make a concerted effort to work with management to ensure that they're adequately prepared for the implementation of these new standards for fiscal 2023. In terms of, sorry, Carrie, if you don't mind moving back 2 more pages, just over to executives, thank you. In terms of overall materiality, which is one of the key issues that we do on an annual basis inform the committee of, we do use this concept of materiality to help guide us in assessing on a whole whether or not the financial statements are fairly presented. We have typically determined materiality based on 2.5% of total expenses on an overall financial statements level. This helps us to assess on the whole at the financial statements level whether or not the statements themselves are fairly presented. We do use a much lower threshold on an individual transaction basis. That is to say, if we are, as part of our audit, to select individual transactions for testing and for sampling, we use a much lower threshold to determine individually if they're materially misstated and what that would imply in terms of our overall audit strategy and whether or not our additional procedures will need to be performed. And we typically set that at 5% of materiality, which is a much lower amount. For the committee's information, as we identify uncorrected misstatements as part of our audit, we're required to report back to you on this lower materiality number. So any misstatements that we identify that are greater than 5% materiality, you can expect that we'll be bringing it forward at the conclusion of our audit for your information. Moving on to the next page, just a couple of items before I pass over to Francesca to help me out with discussing audit risks. In terms of fraud risk, for the committee's information, as a reminder, our financial statement audit is that of financial statements. That is to say, the focus is on ensuring the fairness of presentation of the financial statements. We do not set out specifically to identify fraud. It's not a forensic audit. However, we are required under our professional standards to plan certain procedures that are very targeted towards the potential risk of fraud in financial statements. Fraud risk exists in all organizations, so this is no different than any other audit that we perform. And as part of our risk assessment, there are certain areas that we specifically focus on as part of our audit and where we design very targeted procedures. And Francesca can speak to that later on. As a reminder to the committee as well, just 2 other areas on this page. The audit of HDSB is a group audit. It does include the activities of the Halton Student Transportation Services. And as part of that exercise, we do communicate with the auditors for Halton Student Transportation Services as part of our audit to seek information on the results of their work as part of the overall consolidation impacting the Halton District School Board financial statements. And lastly, on this page, the one other area that we do want to flag for the committee's information is that we do make use of the work of certain specialists employed as part of the overall audit and the financial statements preparation. We do require the use of our own internal IT specialists to help us in testing the operating effectiveness of internal controls over the IT system. So that is something that we have planned to perform every single year, and we will continue to engage their services as well for this year. The school board also makes use of their own actuary in the evaluation of employee future benefits. That is something that we will also be looking into this year as part of our overall audit plan in assessing both their competence as well as the result and outcome of their work. We do perform an independent evaluation of the assumptions as well as the financial modeling that is used by the actuary as part of our audit, and that is something that we will be continuing to do this year as part of our work as well. Moving on to the next page. As I've highlighted on the executive summary, we did identify 6 areas of audit risks that we do want to draw to the committee's information. These 6 areas of audit risks, as I've mentioned, 5 of them are consistent with last year, with 1 that is new relating to accounting policies. And I will be asking Francesca, my manager, to help walk us through at a high level through each of these areas.
Hi, everyone. It's so good to be back with you all. It feels like we were just presenting the results. It's crazy how quickly time flies. And so super excited to be back with you and talking about another year. As Lillian mentioned, our audit risks that we've highlighted in the presentation haven't changed significantly from what we've presented previously to you. The only area that you will see a bit of a change is just around preparation for the new PSAS accounting standards that are going to come into effect in 2023, and our plans to work with management to ensure that those are properly implemented well in advance, so that everyone's ready and things are getting recognized appropriately. So for the first 2 audit risks that we have listed there, you'll see the asterisks beside the title, which indicates that these are actually significant risks within our file. So something that we spend a little bit more time and have a little bit more emphasis on when we do our audit work. And these are considered significant risks for every audit that we perform. They're not unique specifically to Halton District School Board, and that's the risk around revenue recognition and management override of controls. And the reason that these are deemed significant risks is just due to the nature of potential fraud that can happen in regards to them. So for the first one, revenue recognition, there's just a presumption of the fraud risk around improper recognition of revenue. And so for our audit procedures to address this risk, we take a number of different actions within our audit to ensure that we're properly addressing it. The first being understanding where the various funding is coming from, understanding all the different revenue streams that are part of the school board. With that being said, obviously COVID is still something that we're dealing with, and and because of that, there are changes to obviously funding that come from the province, as well as potentially additional funding that comes into play. So, we have very detailed conversations with management to understand any new funding that comes in. We look, and once we get a good understanding of what the funding looks like, we make sure to develop, specific substantive procedures to properly assess and ensure that things are being recognized appropriately and that expenses are, falling in line with the various agreements that go along with funding that's received. We also do a deep dive looking at controls around the various revenue streams, ensuring that they're designed and that they're being implemented appropriately. Doing control walkthroughs and things like that, and seeing actual evidence of the controls being put in place. Anything that we are to identify that we think as a weakness or something that could be improved, that'll be presented to you in a management letter point. In regards, I guess I kind of talked on this with the COVID funding, but obtaining all of the agreements for any specific funding that comes from the province, making sure that the right criteria are being met and that expenses are aligning with the funding that's being received and being recognized. So I think that kind of covers everything in the revenue recognition aspect. For management override of controls, which is our other significant risk item. This is considered to be a presumed risk due to just the ability of management to potentially manipulate controls and override controls that are in place, to potentially fraudulently recognize or maybe even indirectly perpetrate fraud in terms of the accounting records and preparation of the financial statements. So the way that we address this is, we look at all of the controls that are in place around things like management estimate and any high level controls that are in place in terms of the financial reporting and recording, and making sure that, things are designed appropriately and being implemented effectively. We also, talk in depth with management about any significant estimates to get an understanding of how they're developing those estimates. If there's any significant changes from what those estimates were previously, we get a thorough understanding of why there's been a change. We also look at the journal entries for the entire year, and we run specific tests on the data for specific criteria that we deem to be, potentially give us an indication of anything that might be fraudulently going through the journal entries. And then anything that kicks out, we really assess and then go back and have a conversation with management and obtain proper support to validate entries that we deem to be either funny in nature or potentially give way to some potential fraud. As far as other risks go, these aren't considered significant risks, but they are other areas where we do spend quite a bit of time. We do have the risk around the school-generated funds and school council funds. Lillian kind of spoke to this, that we select a sample of schools to audit and perform substantive tests of details, to obtain assurance over their assets, their liabilities, revenue, and expenses. And from that, actually, we've been able to kind of pull out, some management letter comments to go back and provide you with some improvements. So that's one area that we do spend quite a bit of time focusing. The other area is just government transfers related to capital contributions and making sure that, things are being properly capitalized, but also depreciated properly, aligned and within the guidance for your accounting policies for how they should be depreciated. So that's another area. And then there's the employee future benefits. So just looking at the liabilities and the expenses and how those are valued using the actuary that you guys have at the school board, and making sure that everything that is being recorded kind of lines up with our understanding. So, we obtain a good understanding around that. So for the new area, and that's just around the new PSAS accounting standards. So there's two new standards coming into place, and one of them is related to asset retirement obligations, and the other is related to financial instruments. As Lillian mentioned, those will come into effect in 2023. However, we do want to start conversations early with management in 2022 to ensure that, they're doing the appropriate things to obtain the information that they need, engaging consultants where it's necessary, especially in the asset retirement obligation realm of things, just because there is probably quite a bit of valuation to go into some of these areas. And just ensuring as well that there is in-depth analysis on how to, adopt policies for these various changes that are coming into play. I know for myself, high level, just seeing emails go back and forth and speaking with Heather, that this is something that we're already starting on with her. And so, no concerns in that area. We've already kind of got a plan in place. So things are looking good, but we will continue to have conversations with management just to make sure that, things are tracking and trending the right way. So I kind of ran through quite a bit there. I should have probably paused if there's any questions maybe with what I've gone through, or I'll give, you a moment to see if anybody has any questions.
Thank you so much for your report, Francesca. And I did want to note that Sana joined the meeting about 10 minutes ago for the minutes. Dan, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much, Lillian and Francesca. This is a good report. Provides us a good overview. I'm curious about the Auditor General's findings around the financial statement presentation and disclosure requirements. And does that get incorporated into the audit in any way, shape, or form? And kind of what happens with that?
Sure, and maybe I'll respond. The Auditor General's report, and maybe just to caveat that, the Auditor General's report did focus very much on financial reporting from the perspective of public sector accounting standards as a whole. The school board, as you know, follows a modified version of public sector accounting standards based on the ministry's template financial statements. So there are necessarily certain areas where, from the Auditor General's perspective, their findings are based on pure PSAS, whereas the school board really does, especially with Halton District, try very hard to follow the Ministry of Education's issued template financial statements. So there are certain differences there. But what I will say is that we've already had initial discussions with management about the areas that were identified. And I think those are areas that are easily addressed within the financial statements for the coming year. They're fairly minor disclosure items as it relates to the notes. And so we will be continuing to discuss with management as to whether or not they want to incorporate those in order to address those particular items that were identified for our Halton District.
Mhm.
Great, thank you. And I've got a second question, if that's okay, Amy? Yeah. So my second question would be around the asset retirement obligations, and I'm wondering if that's something that this committee could get some further insight into around what the impact of that is specifically going to be on the HDSB. Like, even if we have any estimates of what the ARO liability will be, all of those sorts of things. I'd be curious to know if that's something that Lillian, you and your team could work with Roxana and her team, and provide this committee with some additional info around that.
Certainly, and that's definitely something that we would be able to bring. We can bring the committee background information as it relates to what the standard actually means. And then maybe we can work with management for a first assessment of the impact. The one thing that I will say is that the asset retirement obligation standard is very much something that is on the mind of the Ministry of Education. They are pushing out templates on their end in order to help the school board sector in general with the valuation. So unlike many other public sector entities, that kind of guided effort from the ministry is helpful. It does give more general direction, as opposed to even in other public sector entities as a whole, we're not seeing as much of a guidance. One of the things that Deloitte is doing as well is we are also working with the ministry to develop some of these templates as well. So we're very involved with that process. So certainly we can bring forward some materials to help with the education piece and work with management as well.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Roxana, did you wish to respond?
Just to add to that as part of the March reporting, indirectly, we had to submit a lot of information to the ministry as they consolidate provincially, just so they can get an idea of what to expect. So we have a lot of that information is in draft form and the backup that they require. So we're still waiting for those guidelines in order to make sure it's complete. So I wouldn't want to certainly make an assessment right now or mention what that number may be, because it is very draft and it's an initial figure that we've put together. But we already have a good idea and a lot of information that as a starting point in order to finalize for the audit.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions regarding this report? Okay, I'm going to read the motion. Be it resolved that the Audit Committee recommend to the Board of Trustees the approval of the external audit plan and the fees of $78,960, excluding applicable taxes, attached as Appendix A for the fiscal year ending August 31, 2022, prepared by the Board's external auditors, Deloitte LLP. And I'm looking for a mover and a seconder. I see Dan and Leah. Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments regarding this report? Seeing none, all those in favor? Thank you very much. That motion passes. Moving on in the agenda to our next item. The Regional Internal Audit Plan for 2022-2023, and I'd like to invite Andrea Altherington to speak to this report.
Thank you very much. Through the chair, every year around this time, we bring forward to the Audit Committee a report suggesting the audit plan for the next school year. So that's 22-23 for next year. This one's a little bit different. So I had a discussion with the superintendent of business to confirm that the items that had been identified in June 2021 were still the high risk items for the board. And that was the confirmation of risk mitigation strategies for equity and inclusion, for mental health and well-being for staff as we're doing the students currently, and conducting the network penetration test. So that is what we have on the go for the approved audit plans, and we're recommending that next year would include the confirmation of the risk strategies for equity and inclusion, as well as the penetration, for mental health and well-being for staff and penetration testing, and the third audit of the risk mitigation strategies for equity inclusion to be on the 2023-2024 audit plan.
Thank you very much for this, Andrea. I'm going to read the motion so that we can entertain any questions. As soon as it gets on my page. Be it resolved that the Audit Committee recommends that the 2022-2023 Regional Internal Audit Plan, which includes the confirmation of risk management strategic objective, mental health and well-being for staff, network penetration testing, plus a follow-up review of procurement and any remaining action plans identified during the special education and privacy audits, be approved by the Board of Trustees. And I'm looking for a mover and seconder. Dan and Leah. Are there any comments or questions regarding this report? Seeing none, thank you very much for the comprehensive nature of your report, Andrea. All those in favor? Thank you very much. That motion passes. Okay, moving on to the next item in our agenda. We move into the communication to the Audit Committee items, the Regional Internal Auditor Status Report. Andrea, you have the floor again.
Thank you very much. And through the chair, so the 2022-23 audit plan proposal we just discussed and was approved. Thank you very much for that. And the second part of my status report in open session is just a confirmation that Regional Internal Audit is independent and we were allowed to carry out our work. This is part of our standards for the professional practice of internal auditing, and I confirm once a year to the Audit Committee that we are independent.
Thank you very much. Are there any comments or questions for this report? Thank you very much, Andrea.
Thank you.
And the next item is timelines for financial reporting, presentation to board. And I would ask Superintendent Nguyen to speak to this. It's found on page 27 of your package.
Thank you very much. And this is just an update to our timelines for our main reporting cycles. So 21-22 fiscal year, looking at quarterly reports for the year that are being presented to the Board of Trustees and provided to the Audit Committee as information linked here in the package as we go along, move through the year, just reviewing where we are in terms of actual expenditures and budget. The last quarterly report was presented on March 14th. And it showed that we are on track. However, we have allocated at that point in time the entire contingency to emerging challenges. So we've been monitoring closely just to ensure that we stay within budget. And the next quarterly report will be on the second meeting in June. The other ones, we're looking at the budget for the upcoming year with a presentation going to the Board of Trustees on May the 11th with a proposed draft budget, and the report for approval will be again at the second board meeting in June. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this, Roxana. Are there any questions, comments? For me, it's a huge relief that you've received this Grants for Student Needs earlier this year, in a much better position to present us with a budget. And while we may never have as much as we think we need, it's always good to at least know what we're going to have. Dan.
Yeah, I'm just curious around that point with the budget and kind of the uncertainty provincially with the election and the lack of commitment to the budget as it was presented recently. Is there a risk that the grants could change significantly post-election? Is that something that we need to be worried about, or is it like confirmed? We know the funding that we're getting next year.
And for the chair, there's always a risk the funding can change. So an incoming government, even the same government, can put regulations in place and modify the grants in year. They would be extremely destabilizing, and I would suggest it would be nobody's interest to do. So I think the risk of a significant change is on a smaller scale, but it is possible. The grants for student needs have been confirmed under the provincial budget with more or less a status quo from the current year moving into next year, with the COVID supports being provided, with some aspects from the COVID supports being transferred into the grants for additional support for special education and mental health, for example. So supporting also 2 modes of learning, in-person and virtual, continuing into next year. So that information was provided to us, which we're grateful, and it's a lot of it is status quo, but some of the aspects aren't fully continuing. In addition to that, there was a timed grant, which was significant, about 5.7 million for our board that we had to spend. I think it was announced like March 30th, and we had to spend it starting April 1st to December 31st. We would certainly have appreciated to be able to spend it until the end of next year, as opposed to ending at December. We know that learning gaps are, they require continuous support. It's not something that is a few months and it's been recovered, the learning's been recovered and everybody's up to speed. So there's challenges from that perspective. So we're trying to really make use of as much of that money in a meaningful way, but in a short time frame, while losing some of the funding in other areas or not receiving enough to keep up with costs. So there have been some give and takes, but more or less the funding has been confirmed, and we're hoping it stays the same, even if there is the same or a different government in place, without any significant changes.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Are there any other questions for Superintendent Ngoy? Thank you. Seeing none, we will move on to the next item, which is the 2022 SB06 Memo 2020-2021 Audit Committee Annual Report to the Ministry, also presented by Superintendent Ngoy.
Thank you. And this is just for information. I believe this particular memo is a bit late in being released because it does relate to the 2020-2021 annual report that the Audit Committee sends to the Ministry, which we always look at those in the September meeting and send it off by November, I believe it is. So we've already addressed it. It shows a template which we're following. But we just wanted to include it for your information as we're heading into next September's meeting, which will be looking at the 2021-2022 annual report to the Ministry and using this template unless a new one becomes available from now until then. So no action on this one.
Thank you again, Superintendent Nagoy. Are there any questions of clarification or any concerns? And seeing none, we will move on to the public questions and answers portion of the meeting. Carrie, do we have any questions from the public?
Just give me one quick second to confirm. No responses or questions.
Thank you very much. I know that there are hundreds of people out there watching, so I'm glad that the meeting was so well organized that they have no questions. That leaves us with only one agenda item left, and that's the motion to adjourn. Would anyone like to make that motion? Dan, seconded by Jean. And are there any comments or questions regarding adjournment? Seeing none, all those in favor? And I think that was unanimous, surprisingly enough. Thank you, everyone, and have a pleasant evening.